Are you deaf, or just stupid? Madeline Kingsley hissed the words so sharply that they seemed to slice the air in half. The kitchen of the $140 million Manhattan Sky Estate wasn't used to noise. Everything in that house moved softly, politely, almost scared of waking the walls. But her voice thundered through it, reckless and angry, shaking every person inside the room. Nia Lawson stood near the island counter, clutching a glass pitcher against her uniform. She didn't speak. She didn't push back. She simply stared at Madeline with a calmness that didn't match the moment. But that calmness made things worse. It made Madeline's face twist, like she couldn't stand the idea that someone wasn't trembling before her. I asked for lemon water, Madeline spat, stepping closer. Do you think I have time to wait for you people to get it right? Her heels clicked hard against the tile. Her robe swayed behind her like a shadow that didn't know how to soften. A young maid near the pantry flinched and lowered her head. Everyone knew what Madeline was like when she was displeased. Sharp, heavy, unpredictable. People said she carried stress like a loaded gun, ready to fire at whoever happened to stand closest. Nia lifted her eyes slightly. I was slicing fresh lemons, ma'am, she said quietly. They were out. Madeline froze for half a heartbeat. Then she laughed. Not a happy laugh. A cold laugh. The kind of laugh that meant she didn't want a reason. She wanted someone to blame. Oh, you thought that was a reason to make me wait, she whispered, stepping into Nia's space. You must really believe you're special. Before anyone could breathe, Madeline reached over to the stove. Her hand closed around the handle of a stainless steel pot. Steam curled upward from its rim, thick and furious. Madeline, please, one of the chefs tried to say. But it was too late. Madeline swung her arm and threw the boiling water straight at Nia. The scream tore out of Nia's throat before she even hit the ground. The water splashed across her shoulder and neck, and steam shot upward like smoke from a small explosion. The pitcher crashed to the floor and shattered. Someone shouted her name. Someone else cried out, "Call 911." The room dissolved into chaos so fast it felt unreal. And through all that noise, Madeline just stood there, breathing hard, eyes bright, chest rising and falling with a dark kind of satisfaction. She didn't reach for a towel. She didn't show fear. She didn't show regret. She looked down at Nia as if she'd handled a minor inconvenience. That's what happens, she said quietly, when you forget your place. Nia curled forward, her body shaking, her breath uneven. But even through the pain, her right hand slid toward her uniform, toward the small metallic object hidden beneath the apron. Something she couldn't let Madeline see. Something she couldn't afford to drop. Because Nia Lawson wasn't just another maid. She wasn't there to scrub floors or pour drinks. She had a mission, a target, a truth to uncover. And Madeline Kingsley had no idea that the woman she just attacked was the one person who could destroy everything. The kitchen was spiraling out of control. Madeline was still burning with rage. Nia was barely conscious, but holding on to something far more dangerous than anyone in that house realized. And in that single violent moment, everything in the Kingsley empire began to crack. If stories like this pull you in and you want more, you can go ahead and subscribe. It's completely your call. Now back to our story. The Kingsley penthouse rose over Manhattan the way a crown sits on a king. High, bright, and heavy with the weight of power. From the outside, the building looked like it had been carved out of light. Tall glass walls stretched into the clouds, reflecting the city below like it owned every street, every sound, every heartbeat. People who passed by on the ground never looked up for long. They knew who lived there. They knew what the Kingsley name meant. And most people, even the wealthy ones, preferred not to imagine what went on inside a house that big. Inside the penthouse, everything was quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way expensive places are. Cold. Controlled. Designed to keep people in line. The staff moved softly from room to room, almost afraid to let their footsteps echo. No one raised their voice. No one laughed too loud. No one asked questions. Ethan Kingsley didn't like noise in his home, and Madeline hated anything that felt messy. Between the two of them, silence was the safest place to exist. Ethan Kingsley ruled the public world. The billionaire tech founder who stood beside senators, shook hands with presidents, and spoke on stages that made investors lean forward. He had that smooth way of speaking, the kind that made strangers trust him even when they didn't understand what he was talking about. People loved him. People feared him. And Ethan knew how to use both. Madeline, his wife, ruled the private world. The penthouse was her territory. She curated every detail of that place, every vase, every curtain fold, every servant who walked the hallways. She was a socialite, a face on magazine covers, an influencer with millions of followers who worshipped her taste. But the people who worked under her saw another side. A side that could switch from a smile to fury in one breath. She carried her authority like a weapon. She didn't need to shout often. The threat lived in her eyes long before her voice ever rose. The employees understood the rhythm of the house. Move quietly. Answer quickly. Avoid being seen unless you were needed. And above all, never disappoint Madeline. The last maid who broke a crystal vase by accident had disappeared from the schedule overnight. No explanation given. The staff whispered about it for days, then fell silent again. That was the rule in the Kingsley world. Silence kept you safe. So when Nia Lawson arrived 9 days earlier, walking in with a calm, steady posture, the staff noticed. She carried herself differently from the others, not with pride, but with a quiet strength that didn't match the fear in the house. She listened more than she spoke. She observed more than she reacted. Her movements were smooth, organized, almost too practiced for someone who had just joined the agency. Even the small things, how straight she stood, how she scanned a room before entering, felt out of place for a maid. She worked without rushing. She followed instructions without shrinking. And she looked people in the eye with a softness that still somehow felt firm. The older housekeepers whispered that she was not like the rest. The younger ones watched her closely, unsure if she was brave or naive. Madeline noticed it too. Each day, she watched Nia a little longer than the others. Not because Nia made mistakes, but because she didn't. Something about her presence didn't fit the mold Madeline expected. And Madeline couldn't stand anything she couldn't name or control. By the end of the week, she wasn't just irritated by Nia's calmness. She was bothered by it. And on the morning everything fell apart, Madeline Kingsley felt it again, that small, uncomfortable pull in her chest. Something about Nia Lawson was off. Something she couldn't quite describe. Something she would soon regret discovering too late. But long before Nia ever stepped foot inside the Kingsley penthouse, before she ever wore the uniform, before Madeline ever raised her voice at her, there was another story. One that began far from luxury, far from glass walls, and far from the Kingsley name. It started the day Nia arrived in Manhattan, not as a maid, but as something much different. And much more dangerous. The city felt colder the day Nia arrived. She remembered stepping out of the taxi and pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders as the wind from the Hudson brushed across her face. Manhattan had a way of swallowing people whole. Its noise, its speed, its endless rush. But Nia didn't feel small. She felt steady, focused, ready for what she came to do. A black SUV was already waiting for her near the curb. The back door opened, and Agent Miguel Delgado stepped out. He looked older than she remembered, more gray in his beard, deeper lines around his eyes, but his presence still carried the same weight it always had. He didn't smile, but something in his quiet stare showed he trusted her. And that mattered. "You're late," he said, but his voice was warm. "Traffic," she replied, even though they both knew traffic wasn't the real reason she had paused before coming. Something about this assignment sat heavy on her chest. He saw it in her eyes. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked. Nia nodded. "I've been ready since the day he went missing." Agent Delgado didn't argue. He just opened the door for her and motioned for her to get in. Inside the SUV, the windows were tinted dark. The city lights blurred outside as they drove. Delgado placed a file on her lap, thin, but sharp enough to cut a life in half. On the front page was her real name. Special Agent Nia Lawson, Federal Crimes Division. Below it, Assignment, Kingsley Global Investigation. Nia took a slow breath. The name, Kingsley, still tasted bitter. Her colleague, and her closest partner in the agency, had been a safety inspector assigned to review Kingsley Global's operations. He was smart, careful, and honest to a fault. Weeks before his disappearance, he had told Nia he found irregularities in their construction sites. Misreported accidents, altered documents, strange payment trails. And then one night, he called her with fear in his voice. "I think I'm being followed," he whispered. That was the last time she heard him. His body was never found. His badge was discovered near the river. His case was marked inconclusive. But Nia never believed it was an accident. And neither did the Bureau. Delgado tapped the file gently. "We have reason to believe Ethan Kingsley is protecting more than fraud. There are possible bribes, disappearances, cleaned up accidents. Your partner might not be the only one." Nia's throat tightened slightly, but her voice stayed calm. "So we think Kingsley Global is bigger than just bad accounting?" "We think it's a machine," Delgado said quietly. "A machine that destroys anyone who gets in the way." Nia closed the file. Her decision was already made long before this meeting. She wasn't here to follow orders. She was here for justice. For truth. For the man who never made it home. "What's my cover?" she asked. Delgado handed her a small ID card with a new name printed on it. A simple agency badge. A fabricated work history. "You'll enter the Kingsley home as a domestic worker," he said. "You'll listen. Watch. Record everything. And you'll bring us what we need to finally crack this open." Nia looked out the window again. The city lights stretched endlessly, like a field of stars scattered across the ground. Somewhere across that skyline was the Kingsley penthouse, quiet now, unaware of who was coming. "All right," she said softly. "Let's finish what he started." The SUV turned toward Midtown, and Special Agent Nia Lawson began the mission that would shake the Kingsley empire from the inside out. By the time the elevator doors opened to the Kingsley penthouse, the city outside had already faded from view. The noise, the traffic, the normal world, it all disappeared behind glass and silence. For Nia, this was the beginning of the real test. The moment her mission stopped being a plan on paper and became a heartbeat she could feel under her skin. Nia's first week inside the Kingsley household passed like a blur of white uniforms and quiet orders. Every morning started the same way, before sunrise, before the lights of Manhattan even softened. She learned to move the way the others did. Quick, precise, invisible. The house demanded silence. Conversations were whispers. Footsteps had to disappear beneath the hum of the air vents. Madeline Kingsley ruled the mornings like a storm in heels. She expected perfection without saying it twice. A fingerprint on a glass, a folded napkin half an inch off, even a soft sigh could draw her glare. She never needed to shout. Her anger traveled on the edge of her perfume. One look from her and the entire staff straightened. Ethan Kingsley was different. He was colder, calmer, the kind of man who smiled with his mouth but not his eyes. He rarely spoke to the staff, but when he did, his tone was polite, almost gentle, and somehow that was worse. Everyone knew who really held the power in the house. His approval was currency. His silence was control. Nia played her part. She spoke little. She followed orders. She cleaned and served, her expression soft but distant. But every movement she made had a purpose. Hidden inside the feather duster she carried was a micro-recorder no bigger than a coin. Each night, she found new places to hide it. Under the lip of a marble vase in the hallway. Behind a painting near Ethan's study. Inside the flower arrangement by the dining room door. She worked like a shadow, and no one noticed. By the end of her first week, she had hours of audio. Voices that thought no one was listening. She heard phone calls about offshore transfers, talk of accidents at construction sites, whispers about paying off inspectors to keep stories buried. The more she heard, the heavier her chest felt. These weren't just numbers and deals. These were lives being erased behind closed doors. Late one night, when the house had gone quiet, Nia sat alone in the laundry room with her back against the wall. The hum of the dryer filled the space. She slipped the small recording chip into her palm, watching it glint beneath the dim light. Her voice came out in a whisper meant for no one but herself. "For you, Marcus." The sound of his name steadied her. Marcus had been her partner at the agency. Sharp, disciplined, and loyal in ways most people weren't. They had worked side by side for years, chasing truth through the kind of cases that broke good people down. He wasn't fearless, but he was stubborn enough to face danger anyway. When he started investigating Kingsley Global, he told her he'd found something that scared even him. Then one night, he vanished. No goodbyes. No trace. Just a cold file stamped missing in action. The memory burned behind her ribs like a low fire that never went out. The next day, while delivering documents to the study, Nia noticed a folder left half open on Ethan's desk. Her instincts told her not to look, but her mission told her otherwise. She brushed a finger across the papers just enough to read the title. Site 14, Incident Report. Beneath it, a list of names. 2 of them had small red lines drawn through them. She stepped back before anyone saw her, her heart steady but her stomach turning. There it was, proof that the accidents weren't accidents at all. And as she closed the door quietly behind her, Nia knew the deeper she went, the more dangerous the silence in that house would become. That Sunday morning, the Kingsley penthouse didn't feel like a home. It felt hollow, a place arranged to be admired, not lived in. The glass walls shimmered with city light, the marble floors glowed like mirrors, and every orchid on the dining table looked placed by a machine. Madeline called it a brunch for friends, but the air smelled of nerves and money. Hollywood faces filled the room, all laughter and camera-ready smiles. A senator's wife pretended to enjoy a croissant she wouldn't swallow. Every sound echoed, forks, soft chatter, the faint jazz playing from invisible speakers. The staff moved in near silence, hands folded, eyes lowered. That was the rule. From the kitchen doorway, Nia moved carefully, a silver pitcher balanced in her hands. She'd been assigned drinks, and she worked with the quiet rhythm of someone who knew that one wrong movement could change everything. Madeline entered like a gust of perfume and tension. She wore cream silk and confidence so loud it filled the room. Her heels struck the floor with sharp authority. "I asked for lemon water," she said, her tone crisp, already edged with irritation. "Where is it?" One of the younger maids froze, then looked toward Nia. Nia kept slicing lemons, calm, precise, each piece falling in neat circles into the glass jug. Madeline's voice cut again, sharper. "Do you think I have time to wait for you people to get it right?" The words hit the room like a slap. A spoon dropped somewhere near the stove. No one moved. Nia turned, holding the pitcher close. "I was slicing fresh lemons, ma'am," she said softly. "The ones we had were out." Madeline stared at her for half a heartbeat. Then she laughed, quiet at first, then harder, colder, until the laughter itself felt like an insult. "Oh, you thought that was a reason to make me wait," she whispered, stepping forward. "You must really believe you're special." Nia didn't respond. She stood straight, eyes steady, face calm. That calmness, the dignity of it, set something off inside Madeline. Her face changed. The smile vanished. Fury took its place. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," she snapped. Nia looked up. That single look was all it took. Madeline's hand shot toward the stove. She grabbed the stainless steel pot sitting there, steam curling from its rim, thick and furious. Someone gasped. "Mrs. Kingsley, please." One of the cooks started, but it was already too late. Madeline swung her arm and threw the boiling water. The sound that followed was part hiss, part scream. The water hit Nia's shoulder and neck, spilling down her arm. She staggered back, the pitcher slipping from her hands and shattering against the tile. Steam rose between them like smoke from a fire. Chaos exploded. A maid screamed. A chef rushed forward with a towel. Another shouted for help. The smell of citrus and burnt skin filled the air. Madeline stood frozen for a second, breathing fast. Her face trembled, not with shock, but with twisted satisfaction. "That will teach you," she muttered under her breath. Nia dropped to her knees. Pain clawed through her body, but her right hand pressed tight against her chest, clutching the small metallic chip hidden beneath her uniform. It burned against her skin, But she wouldn't let it go. The mission wasn't over. The elevator doors burst open. Security and paramedics flooded in, voices shouting orders. They lifted Nia gently, wrapping her shoulder, trying to stop the burn. Madeline stepped back, adjusting her robe, pretending to tremble. Ethan remained seated at the far end of the table, wine glass in hand, eyes cold and distant. As they wheeled Nia toward the elevator, one of the maids swore she heard her whisper something faint, barely audible beneath the chaos. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't fear. It was a promise. And in that moment, the silence that followed felt heavier than any scream that could have filled the Kingsley home. If the story has gripped you so far, make sure to subscribe. You won't believe what comes next in the Kingsley mansion. That night, the city below the Kingsley Tower kept moving. Cars honking, lights blinking, people living their lives like nothing had happened. But high above it all, in a quiet hospital room overlooking Manhattan's skyline, the story that started as a scandal inside one family's kitchen was about to become something far bigger. The first thing Nia felt was the cold. A thin chill running beneath the blanket, the kind only hospitals carry. When she tried to move, pain flared through her shoulder, sharp but real, a reminder that she was still alive. For a second, she didn't know where she was. Then the sound of machines filled her ears, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the low hum of oxygen. White walls, blinding lights, a bandage wrapping her neck and arm. She turned her head slowly and saw two figures at the foot of her bed, a doctor in blue scrubs and a man in a gray suit. The suit looked out of place here. "Agent Lawson," the man said quietly. "Don't try to sit up." The title hit the air like a secret finally being spoken aloud. The doctor checked her pulse, nodded, then stepped back to give them space. Behind him, two agents stood near the door, their badges glinting under the fluorescent light. The world still believed she was just a maid, a nameless employee burned by her employer's temper. But inside this room, the truth had already shifted. On the news, the story was spreading fast. Billionaire's wife accused of attacking domestic worker. Clips of the brunch guests leaving in panic. Photos of Madeline being escorted out of the penthouse, face hidden behind dark sunglasses. A public statement from Ethan Kingsley's office calling it a tragic misunderstanding caused by stress and exhaustion. But the agency knew better. And so did Nia. The man in the suit stepped closer. "You're lucky," he said. "It could have been worse." Nia's throat was dry. "The chip," she whispered. Her fingers moved under the blanket, instinctively pressing against her chest. He understood immediately. "We have it," he said. "It's secure." Her eyes softened, relief flickering across them for the first time since the attack. That small metallic chip, the one she had shielded through fire and pain, held hours of audio. Recordings of offshore accounts, conversations about silencing witnesses, coded language tying Ethan Kingsley's company to bribes and disappearances. It was the thread that could unravel everything. The door opened quietly, and a detective entered, uniform crisp, expression steady. He paused at the sight of her, then gave a respectful nod. "Ma'am," he said, "we're moving in tonight. Mrs. Kingsley has been taken into custody." Nia didn't smile, but something inside her finally eased. The doctor adjusted the monitor. "You need rest," he said softly. Nia looked out the window instead. Manhattan stretched endlessly below, bright, loud, alive. The same city that had swallowed her partner, Marcus, now held the truth he'd died for. "Secure the evidence," she murmured again, her voice faint but firm. "And don't let it disappear like he did." The agent nodded once. Outside, sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. Cameras flashed in the dark. The headlines were already writing themselves, but this time, the story didn't belong to the Kingsleys. It belonged to the woman they thought was just a maid. For a few days, the hospital room became Nia's whole world, a place of questions, reports, and quiet recovery. The headlines outside grew louder by the hour. But inside those walls, she began to learn that truth has layers. And the deepest ones don't always lie in the people you suspect most. Sometimes, betrayal wears the face of someone who once called you friend. The knock on her hospital door came just after noon. When it opened, Evan Chase walked in, tall, polished, the kind of man who looked more like a politician than a federal officer. His smile was soft, his tone gentle, almost protective. "Nia," he said quietly, "it's good to see you awake." She hadn't seen him in months. Evan was her senior in the agency. Sharp, confident, respected. He had mentored her when she first joined the division, taught her how to read a suspect's silence, how to stay calm under pressure. He was the man who once told her, "Your mind is your weapon. Never let anyone dull it." Now, standing at the foot of her bed, he looked like someone carrying both pride and pity. "You did well," he said. "The Bureau owes you everything. We'll make sure the evidence gets where it needs to go." Nia studied him for a moment. His words sounded right, but his eyes didn't match. There was a flicker there, faint, controlled, like a man calculating the cost of every breath. He reached for the file on the bedside table, the one holding copies of her recordings. "I'll take this chip," he said smoothly. "I'll personally deliver it to Central Command. You need rest." She hesitated but finally nodded. "Make sure Delgado sees it first," she murmured. "Of course," Evan said, slipping the small chip into his jacket pocket with a calm that didn't draw attention. When he left the room, his expression changed. The warmth fell away, replaced by something colder. Ambition, maybe, or greed that had waited too long. Outside, in the corridor, Evan pulled out his phone and typed a short message. "I have what you want." Minutes later, he was in a car heading toward Midtown. The driver said nothing. The destination was already known, the rooftop office of Ethan Kingsley. The view from up there stretched across the city like a promise. Ethan stood by the window when Evan arrived, wearing that same calm smile that could make guilt look like charm. "You must have gone through a lot to get here," Ethan said. "Let's make it worth your while." He placed a document on the table. The number printed on it made Evan's throat tighten. $150 million. "Deliver that chip," Ethan said softly, "and no one ever has to know you existed." Evan hesitated for only a second before pulling the chip from his pocket. "Pleasure doing business," he said. Ethan took it, crushed it under his heel, and smiled. "That's the end of this mess." But miles away, in her hospital bed, Nia opened her eyes slowly. Her lips curved in the faintest trace of a knowing smile. Because the chip Evan handed over wasn't the real one. It was a decoy she had prepared days before. And while Ethan celebrated his victory and Evan believed he had outsmarted everyone, the real evidence was already on its way to the Bureau's encrypted servers. The game had just turned. And neither man knew it yet. By the next sunrise, the city had already chosen its side. Some called Madeline Kingsley a monster. Others called her a victim of stress. But no matter how the story was spun, one truth was clear. The Kingsley name no longer meant untouchable. And what no one knew yet was that the fall had only just begun. The headlines spread faster than wildfire. Every channel, every talk show, every late-night commentator had something to say. Billionaire's wife arrested for assaulting domestic worker. Clips from the brunch leaked online. The screams, the chaos, the panic in expensive clothes. Madeline's face was blurred at first, but it didn't matter. Everyone knew that voice. Everyone knew that tone. Outside the courthouse, reporters camped in clusters, shouting questions over flashing cameras. "Mrs. Kingsley, do you regret your actions? Was it a planned attack? Where is your husband?" Madeline kept her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses, pretending not to hear. Ethan wasn't by her side. He hadn't been since the day of the incident. He had his own plan. Ethan Kingsley appeared that same week at a press event. A glass podium, a city view behind him, and his lawyer to his left. He wore grief like a tailored suit. "My wife has been under immense emotional pressure," he told the cameras. "Her actions do not reflect who she truly is. Our family asks for privacy during this difficult time." The room flashed with camera lights. He didn't blink. To the world, he looked like a husband standing tall through crisis. To Nia, watching from her hospital bed, he looked like a man rehearsing his innocence. Across town, Evan Chase was adjusting to his new life. He checked into a penthouse suite overlooking Central Park, spent his nights in exclusive bars, and ordered suits that came with champagne service. He told himself he deserved it. After all, no one got rewarded for honesty in this world. And now, he finally had what he believed he'd earned: freedom, power, and silence. But while Evan was toasting his new fortune, the Bureau was already moving quietly behind him. At federal headquarters, a digital monitor blinked with a single phrase: encryption key accepted. The real evidence, Nia's encrypted backups, had just been unlocked. Every recording, every document, every transaction was there. Offshore accounts under Evan's name. Shell companies tied to Kingsley Global. Email trails linking Ethan to missing contractors and bribed inspectors. It was all there, safe and unedited. That afternoon, Nia sat across from her lawyer in a private hospital room. Her arm was still wrapped in gauze, her voice still soft from the painkillers. But her eyes were steady. "The moment they feel safe," she said, "is the moment they fall." Her lawyer smiled faintly. "You're ready to testify?" "I'm ready to finish this," she replied. Outside, the city lights began to flicker as dusk crept over Manhattan. Ethan Kingsley stood on his balcony, drink in hand, believing the storm had passed. Evan Chase leaned back in his suite, believing he had beaten the system. Neither man realized that every move they made was being watched, traced, and recorded. And as Nia stared out the hospital window that night, her reflection in the glass looked calm, too calm, for a woman who had nearly died. Because the real game was only beginning. And this time, she wasn't playing alone. The city had been whispering for weeks, but on that gray Tuesday morning, the whispers turned into thunder. Every screen in Manhattan flickered with one headline: "The Kingsley trial begins." Reporters called it the trial of the decade. For Nia Lawson, it was more than that. It was the day truth would finally speak for itself. The courtroom was packed from wall to wall. Journalists, politicians, business leaders, and ordinary citizens who had waited months to see how power behaves when cornered. Flashbulbs burst as Ethan Kingsley walked in, calm and confident, his designer suit pressed to perfection. He moved like a man walking into a board meeting, not a trial. When he sat down beside his attorney, he even smiled, that thin, polished smile that had fooled investors and voters for years. Across the aisle, Madeline Kingsley looked smaller than ever. The once glamorous socialite now hid behind dark glasses and trembling hands. Her lawyers whispered strategies she could no longer remember. And behind her, Evan Chase tried to keep his head low, his face half turned from the cameras. But even from a distance, guilt has a shape that's hard to disguise. When Nia entered, the room fell quiet. She wore a simple navy suit, her left arm still lightly bandaged beneath the sleeve. No jewelry, no makeup, no performance. Just truth walking on 2 feet. The clicking of cameras echoed like distant rain as she took her seat beside the prosecution. The judge called the room to order. The trial began. Ethan's attorney rose first, smooth and confident. "Members of the court," he said, "what we have here is a tragedy twisted by imagination. This woman," he pointed toward Nia, "was never a maid, never an agent, just a failed employee seeking attention. The so-called evidence she presents was staged, edited, fabricated to destroy a respected family name." A murmur rippled through the audience. Ethan leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a smirk. Then Nia stood. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Your Honor, may I respond?" The judge nodded. From her briefcase, Nia pulled out a small black drive, smooth, unmarked, humming faintly with power. "This," she said, "is the original encrypted data. Not a copy. Not a file passed through hands. The truth, unedited." She walked to the evidence screen and inserted the drive. The courtroom lights dimmed as the first recording played. Ethan's voice filled the speakers. "Transfer it to the offshore account. No trace, no paper trail." Gasps filled the room. Another clip followed, Madeline's icy tone. "If the workers talk, make sure they never speak again." And then came the emails, Ethan approving construction bids linked to fake safety reports, signed under his personal authorization. The judge leaned forward. Reporters typed furiously. Finally, one last video appeared, a grainy rooftop feed showing Evan Chase accepting a briefcase from Ethan, counting the cash before shaking his hand. Evan shot up from his seat. That's edited, he shouted, but the words dissolved into noise. Ethan's face drained of color. His lawyer tried to speak but couldn't. Madeline broke into sobs, covering her mouth as the weight of it all crashed down. The judge's gavel slammed once, echoing like thunder. Order! All 3 defendants are remanded into federal custody pending sentencing. The room erupted, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, spectators clapping despite the judge's warning. Through it all, Nia stood still. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched as the people who once ruled from the top were led out in handcuffs. The story that began with boiling water ended with fire, the fire of justice finally burning clean. By the next morning, the Kingsley name that once stood for power now floated like a broken brand across every headline, every screen, every conversation. The courtroom had ended their story, but what came after was justice unfolding in real time. The news hit the markets first. Within hours of the verdict, Kingsley Global stocks crashed like falling glass. Screens across Wall Street turned red as billions evaporated in a single trading day. Investors pulled out. Partners withdrew contracts. The empire Ethan Kingsley spent 20 years building collapsed before sunset. At his corporate tower, employees stood in silence, watching men in dark suits from the Justice Department box up files and hard drives. The gold nameplate that once read Ethan Kingsley, founder and CEO, came down quietly, placed inside a cardboard box like an afterthought. In his holding cell, Ethan sat on a steel bench staring at the blank wall in front of him. The confidence was gone. No cameras. No applause. Just the echo of everything he had done to stay powerful, now looping back to where it all began. Across town, Evan Chase tried to bargain his way out. He offered names, accounts, details, anything that could lighten his sentence. But the agents listening to him already had the full picture. The offshore transactions he'd tried to hide were traced. Every cent he took from Kingsley's bribe was accounted for. The deal never came. And the man who once thought he outsmarted everyone sat there realizing he had been outplayed by the very woman he underestimated. As for Madeline Kingsley, her fall was louder. The influencer empire she built vanished overnight. Brands cut ties. Followers vanished. Her social media accounts filled with hate, disbelief, and silence. The woman who once controlled every image of herself now had none left to protect. Outside the courthouse that evening, the air buzzed with flashing cameras and chanting crowds. Nia Lawson stepped out, bandages still visible under the cuff of her blazer. The microphones pointed toward her face, but she didn't speak for attention, she spoke for truth. Power without accountability, she said softly, is a crime. The words carried far beyond the crowd. They played on every channel, quoted on every feed, replayed in classrooms and offices as the sound of a world remembering what justice can still look like. Later that week, when the noise began to fade, Nia visited the small memorial site by the East River. A quiet stone bench overlooking the water. A single plaque read, "In memory of Special Agent Marcus Reed, gone, but not forgotten." She stood there for a long time, the wind brushing against her coat, the city glowing behind her. No cameras. No witnesses. Just her and the sound of the water. "I did it," she whispered. "We did." The peace that settled over her wasn't loud. It was quiet, the kind that feels earned. As the sun sank behind the skyline, Nia turned to leave, her figure disappearing into the crowd of an ordinary evening. She no longer needed to hide. The mission was over. But the message remained. Power could build towers, by silence, even rewrite laws, but it could never outrun the truth. A month later, the noise had quieted. The trials were over, the headlines had faded, and justice had done what it was meant to do. But in Washington, D.C., one final story was still waiting to be told. The story of the woman who faced power and didn't bow to it. The morning sun rose over Washington like gold poured across marble. The Capitol dome gleamed in the distance as motorcades lined the street outside the Federal Hall. Inside, rows of polished seats filled quickly. Senators, judges, bureau chiefs, and decorated agents all gathered for a ceremony the country hadn't seen in years. When the announcer called her name, Special Agent Nia Lawson, the room stood in unison. The applause was steady at first, then grew louder, rolling like a wave. Cameras flashed. Every face turned toward the woman walking down the aisle in a simple black suit, her posture straight, her steps calm. The scars on her arm were faint now, but they still told a story louder than any introduction could. At the podium, the director of the Federal Crimes Division pinned a gold medal to her lapel, the Federal Medal of Honor for bravery in service. He spoke about integrity, courage, and the price of truth. But when he stepped aside, it was Nia's voice that filled the room and quieted it again. She didn't read from notes. She didn't need to. To every woman who has ever been underestimated, she began, her voice steady, clear, and warm. To every person who has ever been told to stay quiet, to keep their head down, to stop asking questions, let my story remind you of something simple. She paused, looking across the room at faces that carried power, history, and guilt. Truth, she said softly, burns brighter than fear. A hush fell over the hall. Even the cameras seemed to slow, holding on to that one line, the kind that would be quoted for years to come. Nia looked down at the medal shining against her chest, then lifted her eyes again. This isn't just mine, she continued. It belongs to someone who never made it to this moment. My partner, Marcus Reed. He believed in this fight before anyone else did. And when the world turned away, he kept digging. So I accept this in his name. Her voice wavered just slightly on that last line, but she didn't hide it. Strength, she knew, wasn't about silence. It was about standing tall even when your voice shakes. The room rose again, louder this time, the applause echoing through the marble walls like thunder that wouldn't stop. Reporters leaned forward, flashes cutting through the air. Nia stepped down from the stage, shaking hands, thanking people she barely knew. Outside, the sound of her name followed her, shouted by journalists, echoed by strangers, carried by the wind. She walked through the front doors and into the sunlight. The city's bright light caught the medal at her chest, turning it into a glint of fire. For a moment, she closed her eyes and breathed. No more disguises, no more fear. Just freedom. Then she smiled, stepped off the marble steps, and disappeared into the moving crowd. Not as the maid who once hid behind silence, but as the woman who proved that even the mightiest fall when truth decides to stand. If Nia's story moved you, take a moment to share it. And if you believe truth still matters in a world that tries to bury it, you can stay with us, subscribe, and keep watching stories that remind us what courage really looks like.